Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Compassion Consortium's maiden voyage. What a pleasure to be here with all of you. And what a pleasure I have to be introducing our very first special guest, Bruce Friedrich. Now, Bruce Friedrich has done so much in the world. If you're looking at the order of service, you'll see all of his degrees and all of his TV shows and all the accolades from the world. But I'd like to introduce him as someone that I have known for a really, really long time. When I met Bruce Friedrich, he was in college and I was, well, out of college. And having watched him for these decades since and seeing what he has done to make substantial change in this world and so much more to come, and also what a great spiritual light Bruce Friedrich is in the world is just a joy for me. And I know that you are going to get a lot out of what he has to say. So here's a little bit of official bio. Bruce is a leftist Catholic who founded and runs the Good Food Institute, which is a global organization focused on working with governments and the largest corporations in the world to remake meat. With more than 100 full-time members across the US, India, Israel, Brazil, Europe, Asia Pacific, GFI is accelerating, and we're celebrating, the production of plant-based and cultivated meat to protect our environment, promote global health, prevent food insecurity, and help animals. Welcome, Bruce Friedrich.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here, Victoria. Thank you. This is really a beautiful way to spend time. It's really, I'm honored.
Well, thank you. And that's a great shirt. Very appropriate. So take us back, Bruce. I want to know about your childhood. Were you the kind of kid that anybody would have thought would end up doing what you do now?
My parents were pretty progressive and were supportive of casting your lot with the least of these. Not super religious, but I was taken in the 80s to marches about Central America, and this was in Oklahoma. Also gay rights marches in the mid 80s in Oklahoma, which was not a particularly hospitable place for gay rights in the early and mid 80s. So I think progressive focus of some sort, probably fairly predictable considering my parents being pretty supportive of those sorts of things. Running an organization focused on what the Good Food Institute is focused on, and working with some of the biggest food and meat companies in the world, as well as governments. I imagine very few people would have predicted that at any point up until even just a couple of years ago. But trying to make the world a more just and compassionate place, probably somewhat predictable.
So what led you to choose a vegan lifestyle?
So it was a confluence of factors. I got to university in 1987, and I joined. I considered myself sort of Joe Radical, which was a pretty low bar in Oklahoma. If you knew that what was happening in Central America, you were pretty much Joe Radical in my high school, and I did. I joined some lefty organizations. One of them was called Latin American Support Organization. Another one was called Poverty Action Now. And even in 1987, in the cornfields of Iowa, the little granola crunchy college where I went, Grinnell College, there were a fair number of people who were vegetarian and vegan. So I read Diet for a Small Planet and thought, oh my God, the way that we are growing crops to feed them to animals is leading to global poverty, and that's horrible. And I went mostly vegan. And then in 1987, during Thanksgiving break, I camped out in the library reading your articles in Animals Agenda, and learned that protein complementing is a myth, and got more deeply into the animal component of veganism. And so you helped me move from vegetarian to vegan. and also educated me about the cruelty to animals involved. It wasn't just entrenching global poverty and vastly inefficient, but also the other beings with whom we share the planet. So I called up Victoria, said, we're driving, I see that you're in Kansas City, we're driving through Kansas City. I'm not a stalker. Can my parents and my girlfriend and I come see you? And you very graciously agreed, which was, that's probably the only sort of fan phone call I've ever made, I would guess.
It seems to me that you were doing social media before social media, because when people say, what can I do to go vegan and stay vegan, because I don't know anybody who does this, it seems so weird. Well, you reach out to people, which is really easy nowadays. But back when you were doing it, you had to say, I'm not a stalker. So I'm really
I
glad you
found your
did.
phone number. You were in the phone book. You're very lucky.
Yeah, the phone book, the Facebook of yesteryear. So right around this time, a little bit after, I think, when you were in college or after you'd left college, you did just the opposite of what I did at around the same time of life. I had been raised Catholic and left the church, and you found the Catholic Church. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I dropped out of college for about 6 years. So Mitch Snyder, the homeless advocate, came to my campus. The group I was running, helping run Poverty Action Now, we brought him to my campus my first year and my second year. And he basically came and told us we were all wasting our lives unless we dropped out and joined the revolution. So I'll cut this fairly short and just say I did drop out for almost 6 years and went and joined the Catholic Worker in Washington, D.C. I joined the Catholic Worker in order to run a homeless shelter and a soup kitchen, which I did for about 6 years, but they also had a chapel in the basement. They had mass every Saturday in the basement. They went to a leftist progressive Catholic parish, Jesuit parish called St. Aloysius every Sunday. Some members of the community would go to daily mass multiple times a year. We had multiple excommunicated priests in the community. And I just fell in love with Catholicism. I fell in love with the just works. I fell in love with the daily focus on living like Christ. I fell in love with Dorothy Day and the works of mercy and voluntary poverty and challenging the unjust structures of oppression. Richard Rohr, a Franciscan priest, had written a book. I think it might be called Why Be Catholic? And he came and gave a retreat to those of us at the Catholic Worker, which was very moving. And basically, my friends who were priests and Richard Rohr and my spiritual advisor, a Jesuit priest called George Anderson, convinced me that you redeem the Catholic Church from inside it, not outside it. So despite all the failings of the church, St. Lawrence talks about we are the church is the people. And if all the progressives leave, the church just becomes a cult of Opus Dei. So decided to join Catholicism and have not regretted that decision since. I continue to think that redeeming the church is part of what being a member of the church is supposed to be about.
So for people who don't know anything about Dorothy Day, give us a little synopsis of her life and work.
So Dorothy Day was a communist writer. She wrote for the Commonweal in the 1920s. In the 1930s, she converted to Catholicism. She was writing for the Commonweal. She learned about the works of mercy, Matthew 25, the one time when Jesus talks about what it means to be a Christian. And he doesn't talk about saying you are a Christian or a Catholic or anything else. He talks about casting your lot with the least of these. Did you house the homeless? Did you feed the hungry? Did you visit the sick and in prison? Did you clothe the naked? That is what Christianity looks like. And Dorothy Day founded a movement called the Catholic Worker, which was focused on living like Jesus, essentially. And there are now probably 140 Catholic worker houses around the world, most in the United States. And they are focused on the works of mercy. They're focused on feeding the hungry and housing the homeless and visiting the sick and imprisoned. There are multiple outside of prisons, and they offer free housing to people who are coming to visit people in prison who are obviously almost all poor, vastly disproportionately poor. And folks in the Catholic Worker live in voluntary poverty, so they live with the communities that they serve. And they challenge what Dorothy Day called the filthy, rotten system, which is responsible for homelessness and hunger and sickness and imprisonment, et cetera. And interestingly, when the Pope was in town in Washington, D.C. in 2015, he gave two addresses. One was to a joint session of Congress. One was he was canonizing a saint at the shrine, at the Basilica of the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. In both cases, he talked about three people, and Dorothy Day was the one crossover. So he talked about Dorothy Day as one of his three stories of faithfulness to the joint session of Congress, and he talked about Dorothy Day as he was canonizing a saint at the shrine of the Basilica of the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. It's a mouthful.
So you left there, but you certainly didn't leave behind all these works of mercy. Where did you take them after that?
So I left while I was at the Catholic Worker. I read a book called Christianity and the Rights of Animals by a theologian who probably most people on this call are aware of, I would guess, Andrew Lindsay, professor of theology at Oxford. Has written a bunch of really powerful books in which he basically posits a liberation theology for animals and suggests that animals are made of flesh and blood and bone, just like human beings are. They have the same 5 physiological senses that we do. They are more like us than they are unlike us. And he basically suggests that they are the least of these for our time, and that Christians should be on the front lines decrying their treatment and naming it as sin. I was really taken with that concept. I've been a vegan for years and certainly understood the animal rights arguments as well as the ecological and global poverty arguments. But in terms of thinking about, I mean, I was sort of effective altruist before effective altruist had a name. So for people who don't know, the sort of mantra of effective altruism, or the 3-part test of effective altruism: 1, is it like super important? 2, is it tractable? Can you make change? And 3, is it neglected? And for me, obviously, cruelty to animals, hugely important. Tractable, absolutely. Everybody likes animals, and yet with our lives, we're causing them immense suffering. And then for me, the real kicker was neglected. And the reason that I decided to stop doing poverty work and start doing animal rights work was that when I would talk about my poverty work, everybody would say, "Oh, thank you. That's so wonderful. That's so great that you're living with the poor and doing this incredible work." Whereas everybody here knows when you talk about veganism or animal rights work, people say, "Why aren't you doing something for human beings?" And for me, that was the kicker. The fact that people, and I love, people would ask that, and I would say, because you're asking that question, because you are a compassionate person and you are asking that question, and animals have rights too, and their suffering is no less important than ours. But everybody says, praise to you if you do something for humans, and they don't say that if you're doing something for animals. That alone, I think, is reason for those of us who understand what's going on to cast our lot with animals.
Mm. And Bruce, I don't want to cause any Bible guilt if you can't quote this off the top of your head, but for people who have a different tradition rather than Christianity, can you do the quote that has the least of these in it so we know where you're coming from with that?
Yeah, it's in Matthew 25, and it's a story that Jesus tells where he's preaching, and he is asked, and he tells the story of salvation, essentially. And the quote is, "As you did it to the least of these, you did it to me." But he really hammers it home because the people are saying, why are we damned, essentially, and why are we saved? And the people who are saved, he says, "When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick and imprisoned, you visited me." And they say, "When did we do that?" And he says, "When you did it to the least of these, you did it to me." And then he flips it. It's kind of twice as long as it really needs to be, because then the people who are condemned are, why are we condemned? And he says, when I was hungry, you did not give me food. When I was naked, you did not clothe me. When I was sick and in prison, you did not visit me. And the point is, as you did it to the least of these, so you did it to me. And that is the founding principle of lefty Catholicism. It's the founding principle of the Catholic worker. It's where the concept of the works of mercy comes from. And it's what salvation looks like.
Now, why did I think that you might even slightly have a problem coming up with a quotation? Maybe the Compassion Consortium can have yet another ministry. We've got our book and film night in the middle of the month. We should have something like Stump the Activist. That would be pretty fun. So you were out in the world doing all of these wonderful things for animals, which you've been doing for many, many years with many organizations, one with the shirt that you're wearing, and a practicing Catholic. And then in 2015, the Pope wrote something, an encyclical called Laudato Si, that you called, quote, almost an animal rights manifesto. And yet, we haven't seen great changes coming from the church in this area. So, how do you respond practically and emotionally to what looked like this great opportunity? And maybe it still is.
Oh, I think it still is. I absolutely think it still is. It was a fascinating snapshot into how the media works, because there was a front page piece in the New York Times about Benedict saying that animals have souls and will be found in heaven. And it was wrong, but it was front page of the New York Times. So it just went absolutely global. This was maybe in 2011 or something like that. So I pulled up all of the reporters who had written that story, and I contacted them and I said, look, it's a papal encyclical. He says animals have souls. He says animals are going to be in heaven. And he just excoriates, and he actually uses the word anthropocentrism, which he excoriates in the encyclical. So I called all of the religion reporters. I called all the people who had gotten it wrong about Benedict, and pretty much nobody, it was just like everybody follows the New York Times. And I couldn't get the New York Times reporter to write about it, so nobody else was going to write about it. It was really fascinating. So I ended up writing about it for the LA Times, USA Today, and the New York Daily News, different takes on, the papal encyclical. And I convinced Nicholas Kristof to write about it, which is pretty great, for the Sunday New York Times. And he links to my New York Daily News piece in his writing about it. But I don't know what to say, Victoria. I've had a lot of conversations with people about that. One of the things that a friend of mine who's a Catholic worker in Virginia, he said, that the church works in centuries. It just takes a really long time for the church to change. And honestly, even the Catechism, which Benedict wrote when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, the Catechism says it is a sin to cause animals to suffer needlessly. So I had already been sort of preaching the gospel of, do we need to eat meat? No. Ergo, the Catholic Catechism says that it's a sin to eat meat, which is not a stretch. We don't need to eat meat. Causing animals to suffer needlessly is a sin. Ergo, it's a Catholic sin to eat meat, which is a point I've been making for a really long time. But I don't know, just hold out hope. And recognize that we have right on our side, even if human beings are pretty slow to change.
I love what you said about centuries, and it is wonderful that we don't have to wait for institutions, that regular people can do so much, especially with where we decide to spend our money and what we want to eat, what we want to wear. So there was a recent documentary, Meet the Future. There is a recent documentary. In fact, it's quite new. And you said something, this is probably not a direct quote because I'm not quoting you as well as you quoted Jesus, but you said something like, having affordable, delicious, plant-based and cell-based animal foods is the only way that will make a substantial dent in animal agriculture. Why can't more people be reached through the heart? And if they can't, what do we do to get this other thing going? It's already going, but all the way.
One of my favorite stories. So there's a polling group called the Sentience Institute. And it's an animal protection think tank, also a part of the effective altruism movement. And like maybe 4 years ago, something like that, they released the results of a poll where they found that 47% of Americans said they want to ban slaughterhouses. The meat industry, as you can imagine, was like, wait a minute, 2% of Americans are vegetarian, less than 1% of America is vegan. There's no way 47% of Americans want to ban slaughterhouses. This is crazy. So they commissioned the guy who is currently the head of ag sciences at Purdue. He's the dean of the School of Ag Sciences at Purdue. He was at Oklahoma State at the time, a guy named Jason Lusk. And so Jason ran the poll, and he got the exact same percentage. 47% of Americans want to ban slaughterhouses. And yet, the percentage of people who are vegetarian and vegan does not go up. The percentage of people who say they're vegetarian or vegan has gone up, but like something like 7/8 of those people have eaten meat in the last month. And the reason I think that's true is that food is systems one thinking. So the economist, the Nobel laureate in economics, Daniel Kahneman, talks about systems one thinking and systems two thinking. And you've just got this fascinating thing where what people eat is dictated by what is delicious and what is inexpensive. And that is just about it. I mean, even at Whole Foods, which represents less than 2% of grocery, you watch what people are buying and eating, and it is just crap. So people are not living in accordance with their ethics right now. You look at something like California and Massachusetts banning intensive animal confinement, overwhelmingly. And in California, they did it the same year that they passed that hideous anti-gay law, which made for signature gathering kind of interesting because you'd be out there signature gathering to ban intensive confinement. People would think you were gathering signatures to make gay marriage illegal, which led to some interesting confrontations. But at the end of the day, that passed, and like 70% of Californians said, we think it should be illegal to confine animals in these hideous systems. So people want to be kind, but there's just something about food. So if we can give consumers what they like about meat, but we can do it at a lower cost, which is to say, if we can take plants and we can give consumers the exact same meat experience, or we can cultivate the cells directly, both of these processes are so much more efficient that the products can taste the same or better to consumers. They can cost the same or less, and people will be able to eat in accordance with their ethics. So that's basically the thesis of GFI.
That works. Now, you are working with a lot of big corporations, and you certainly started out a little bit past the era of sock it to the man and don't trust anybody over 30, but not too far. So how do you reconcile what you're doing now with your long-held beliefs?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I think back to a couple of conversations I had, one with Ingrid Newkirk, the president of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And she said something very close to, I'd work with Satan if it would cause animals to suffer less. And then the flip side of that, which is almost the diametrical flip side of that, is a guy named Steve Gross, who's the board chair of a wonderful organization called Farm Forward. And Steve said, everybody wants their kids to be proud of them. And he said, you need to look into people's eyes and recognize that all human beings, they want to be loved. They want people to be proud of them. They want their lives to have positive meaning. And if you go into every conversation with that sort of an attitude, you can move mountains. And when I was at PETA with Steve working pro bono for PETA, we got McDonald's to ban the forced molting of hens and to not radically change, but to markedly improve lives for laying hens, to put teeth in their slaughter standards. I wouldn't, things are not better than terrible, but for the animals involved, it was significantly less suffering, is significantly less suffering. And as McDonald's goes, so goes the whole egg industry. So forced molting is gone as a result of McDonald's commitment. And that wouldn't have happened if Steve hadn't been willing to, sit with people like Bob Langert and Temple Grandin and Joy Mensch and other people, and see them as human beings, and talk to them as people who want to do good in the world, who don't see eye to eye with us at the moment, but can be brought into the light as patronizing. It's not that. But especially with the transition away from industrial animal agriculture, like, these companies want to, the people in these companies, if you ask them, what are you doing? They will say, we're providing high quality protein at an affordable cost to lots and lots of people. If they can do that without the adverse environmental consequences, without the inefficiency, without the cruelty, that's not a super hard sell, as long as we're willing to have those conversations and do that work.
You're no stranger to controversy and difficult questions, so I'm just going to slip one in because of what you were just talking about. You are fine with initiatives that help some, even if they don't change the world yesterday. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the McDonald's, and this was one where Ingrid had to change my thinking. I wanted to keep pounding McDonald's even after they made these concessions. And she said, look, these concessions are going to improve animals' lives. So force molting, for people who don't know, animals would be starved for up to 2 weeks to shock their bodies into another laying cycle. And McDonald's didn't agree to eliminate cages. They couldn't have profitably done that, but they did agree to go from 7 or 8 hens per cage to 5 hens per cage, which causes death losses to fall from about 20% to about 2%. So imagine the improvement in life for every single animal in that cage if they go from a condition where 1/5 of the animals are dying to 1/50th of the animals. So it's still horrible, and it's very, very easy to pull up the videos and go, oh my God, how can you support this? But from the perspective of the animals involved, the difference is significant. And the difference between auditing your slaughterhouses and cutting slaughterhouses off for egregious abuse is significant in the lives of literally hundreds of millions or even billions, if you're talking about chickens, of animals every single year. So for me, it's about applying the golden rule beyond the species barrier. And I know there are a lot of people in the animal protection movement who are like, not empty cages, but no cages, and who actually oppose initiatives to switch to controlled atmosphere killing. And I think it's a failure of empathy. I think it's an interest in being right at the expense of doing an amazing amount of good. And I think it's sad.
Thank you, Bruce. I would love to know what, in your definition, is a spiritual life, and can you give us a look at yours? What's it like today?
Oh, that's well, I think a spiritual life is a life that takes, I think as Micah, what does it mean? But that you, so here's my attempt to come up with a Bible quote, but that you love mercy, walk humbly, and act justly, but I think maybe not in that order.
I know that one. It's to love mercy, do justice, and walk humbly with thy God.
All right, and is that Micah or Amos?
That is Micah.
Okay, excellent. In any event, that's what I think a spiritual life is. Everything else is gloss. Are you leading your life in accordance with the principles of the works of mercy? Are you acting justly and loving mercy and walking humbly? And that's what I try to do. I do also have a prayer life, but I think the prayer life basically helps to bring mindfulness and a capacity to focus to a life that is really just focused on making the world a kinder and more just place. And I think spirituality without a focus on making the world a kinder and more just place is a false spirituality. So no matter how much meditation and prayer and how many times one goes, takes Eucharist in a week, if your life is not focused on making the world a kinder and more just place, I would say it's devoid of spirituality.
I think you've got something going on, Bruce Friedrich. Now, I want to ask you a kind of personal question, but it actually applies to what's going on in our country right now as well. So, the Compassion Consortium is an interfaith undertaking, and you have a kind of interfaith marriage. Your lovely wife, Alka, is a tireless worker on behalf of animals, laboratory animals in particular. And I believe she was raised Hindu and is now not a religious person. And in this time when people who see things differently can barely coexist in a country, how do the two of you do it in the same house?
Um, I'm going to quote Dorothy Day and Gandhi. Gandhi, when he was opining, and actually they were both journalists. That's kind of fascinating. Gandhi wrote constantly, and Dorothy Day wrote constantly. One of the things that Gandhi talked about was the uniform nature of focus on compassion of all spirituality. And he said, if you're a Muslim, be a good Muslim. If you're a Hindu, be a good Hindu. If you're a Christian, be a good Christian. If you're a Jew, be a good Jew. He might have stopped there. I'm not sure what he thought of Buddhists, but the point was that exactly what I was just saying, spirituality is about how you lead your life. Dorothy Day, similarly, devoutly Catholic, went to Mass every single day. And she wrote about the idea that there are people who profess atheism, who are Catholics by the way they live their lives, and those who profess Catholicism, who are atheists by the way they live their lives. And for anybody who isn't familiar with Dorothy, there's a collection of her writings that Robert Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg of Pentagon Papers, his son is Robert Ellsberg, and he may or may not still be at Maryknoll, but while he was at Maryknoll Publishing, he put together a collection of Dorothy's writings called By Little and By Little, the collected writings of Dorothy Day. And that essay is in there along with some other really just beautiful reflections on what it means to lead a devout and spiritual life.
Beautiful. And the two of you, by the way, are our saints for the animals, whatever spiritual path you profess. So give us some good news from and about GFI and what is happening in the plant-based and cultured meat world, and what can we celebrate?
There's a lot to celebrate. Ezra Klein has the first piece in a major media outlet today, just went up in the New York Times, which is GFI's precise theory of change. So the idea is that the products need to taste the same or better and cost the same or less, just like governments subsidize research and development into renewable energy, and just like governments incentivize the shift to electric vehicles and renewable energy. Our number one policy goal globally is that plant-based meat and cultivated meat be incentivized by governments. And we have a bunch of champions in both the House and the Senate. And Ezra goes all in today's Sunday New York Times advocating this. We put together a proposal to the Biden team, the Build Back Better team, for $2 billion, $1 billion for open access science, and $1 billion for research centers. And Ezra calls it laughably small in his column today, and links to it. So from his lips to John Kerry's ears, but really making some excellent inroads into the climate community. So Bill Gates's NGO, which just launched a couple months ago, Breakthrough Energy, we worked with them on their food policy, and they have endorsed exactly what we asked them to endorse, which is not super surprising. We took to Twitter and LinkedIn to brag about it, and Bill Gates shouted us out on LinkedIn, talked about the great relationship that Breakthrough Energy has with the Good Food Institute, which was pretty gratifying. But we're making really good inroads with the climate community and with the folks who are trying to stop pandemics. So I think it's not going to be easy. Like even cultivating meat directly from cells, will be cost competitive with beef circa 2030 if we're successful in getting government support for it. But we can do it. I think the end of industrial animal agriculture is in our sights. And I think we're going to have the folks in the global health and the climate and the biodiversity communities helping us to relegate industrial animal agriculture to the dustbin of history. I'm super optimistic.
Wow. And in our last 1.5 minutes, What can we do? What can a group of people who care about animals, who have a spiritual life, what can we do right now today to push this thing forward?
Well, you can contact your members of Congress and tell them that you really hope that they will support funding for alternative proteins. We were successful in putting it into the confirmation hearings of both the head of the National Science Foundation as well as USDA, especially if you know your member of Congress and your senators, letting them know that this is important to you. And that it should be part of Biden's American Jobs Plan could be extremely influential. But honestly, I think if people are leading a vegan life and speaking up, one thing I just strongly advocate is if somebody asks you why you believe that veganism is a moral imperative, having conversations with people about that, but not, browbeating them, actually having conversations. Because I do think people are good. People are opposed to cruelty. If folks are eating animal products, they are living outside of their own values, and rather than ramming that down their throats, having a loving conversation and asking questions and trying to see things from their perspective, that's going to be the most effective way, I think, of helping to make inroads in sort of our personal lives as well.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you for stalking me years and years ago, and thank you for this loving conversation.